fibre to 5G and new infrastructure, investment to support the cloud is booming. Joining me is Pieter-Jan Bouten, Managing Director at Greenhill, to discuss this further. Thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Firstly, I want to talk about the investment trends that you've witnessed in this sector.
Okay, to start with, I would say kind of the biggest trend is that investors are, I would say, increasingly realizing and they're more and more convinced about the value that digital infrastructure plays in, I would say, an ever-connected world. And that value proposition is really kind of rising dramatically. And against that kind of background, we see kind of an increased convergence and actually an increased emergence of digital infrastructure as a single asset class. So before we were talking about kind of data centers and fiber and towers as kind of separate kind of categories almost. And investors are realizing that actually they all share very similar characteristics. And those characteristics are kind of increasingly picked up by kind of infrastructure funds and by pension funds who see these businesses as kind of providing an essential service, having high barriers to entry and ultimately kind of very kind of recurring revenues that are very, very defensible.
And what are some of the challenges and opportunities that you've noticed? Obviously you spoke about it in the past, but give us a broader view of some of the challenges and opportunities.
Well, I think the broadest view is you actually have to start not looking at kind of data center operators or the fiber operators, you have to start looking at the telcos, because they are the guys who ultimately have the building blocks. They typically have the fiber, or they typically have the data centers, and they do have tower infrastructure, but they are also increasingly challenged, and they're challenged because ultimately they do not have a very competitive cost of capital, and especially if you compare that cost of capital with the private capital that we see looking at this sector. And that private capital, as I mentioned earlier, is there increasingly kind of the infrastructure funds and the pension funds, where you have competing pools of capital, where you have a lot of dry powder who is looking to deploy and who is looking to kind of invest and ultimately kind of eat the telco's lunch.
How important is Data Cloud, this conference, to you and your company? What are you hoping to get from this whole event, this conference?
I think, Data Cloud is probably if there's one event one goes to a year when it comes to kind of data center connectivity, the broader digital infrastructure, it is Data Cloud here in Monaco. And really the reason is because it's an ecosystem. It's where everybody gathers, where you can not only meet the other investors, but all the big operators, but also the suppliers. And you really kind of get a much more holistic view of kind of the whole industry packed into 2 very intensive days.
And what tips do you have for enterprises in terms of investment? Where should they be investing?
Well, I think the most critical and most important part of the value chain is increasingly the underlying infrastructure. So if you think about a telco going all the way from the infrastructure to the services side is increasingly challenged, and you immediately have kind of the big threats from the cloud and from hyperscale and from over-the-top content, whereas the infrastructure is the bottleneck. And I would argue that's the most valuable part, and I would argue that's where you would put your money.
And what do you have to say for some of those people that focus more on risk, and they're worried about risk in terms of investment? What are some of the advice that you can give in terms of risk in investing in data centers or investing in telco in general?
I think the investment category has de-risked quite significantly, and that has been proven kind of and has proven to be actually shown quite good longevity. And I think the key bit there is around investing into data centers that do have the barriers to entry, that do have the connectivity, but also think about digital infrastructure holistically, and also think about connectivity and other investment and growth opportunities over and beyond kind of traditional co-location, or over and beyond servicing the hyperscale customers.
And in terms of data center and investment, where do you see this going? Where do you see this, the future of it in 10 years' time, 5 years' time?
Well, I think if you'd asked me that question even 2-3 years ago, I would say we're kind of on trend for an increased kind of oligopoly on the data center side between, let's call it, Equinix, Digital Realty Trust, and arguably Interaction in Europe. But I think we've proven to be wrong, because there's constantly kind of new players emerging, new acquirers, new platforms and new competitors that are kind of catering that ever-flowing demand. So I think the jury is out on kind of who's going to be the winners in the long term, but increased consolidation is definitely the trend.
Thank you so much for talking to me today.
Welcome.
Don't forget you can follow Data Economy on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn and Instagram, and visit our website on www.data-economy.com.